Hi, everybody. So, this is a topic I've been thinking about for quite some time, and I've been thinking about doing this video, maybe a few more, depending on kind of what the response is like, just on the topic of evangelical misunderstanding of Jewish law. If you've been following my videos, you'll have seen this theme pop up in recent videos, especially some of the book reviews I've done, and then I also posted a reading list of 10 recommended books on recovering a more Jewish understanding of essentially the background of the New Testament. And I've been on a deep dive on this for years. That reading list of those 10 books is kind of the tip of the iceberg of some of the stuff I've been studying and learning about. And as someone who grew up in I would just say like popular conservative evangelicalism in the 90s, I was born in the mid 80s. I grew up very much in that setting, was formed by it, and was taught a lot about how to understand Scripture and particularly the ministry of Jesus in that setting. And there are key, really, really striking kind of frames, lenses, ways I've been taught to view Scripture in particular, that as I have studied really deeply, more deeply, the setting of the Old Testament background and what Torah meant and what Torah meant to the Jewish people, all of that stuff, as I've studied that more and more, I've found that there are significant pillars of my evangelical upbringing that were just simply not understanding correctly what the law was doing or what Torah was doing for the Israelite people in its time and place. And this has been, to varying degrees, kind of distressing to me, kind of concerning to me. And it's something I've become more and more passionate about helping people with my background or similar backgrounds to helpfully deconstruct some unhelpful things and then reconstruct some more positively helpful things when it comes to just understanding what Torah is. I'm not going to put myself forward as an expert by any means. I'm going to hopefully point to people who are experts in some of the reading that I've done, and I would use my reading list of those 10 books as that's kind of my annotated bibliography for this video and any others that I do on this topic. Those are really the top sources for me. And I'll point to some of them specifically when appropriate as I talk through this. But this is in my Barely-Vangelical video series because it very much captures that mode of rethinking assumptions that I had been taught, especially as a child and growing into my teen years, rethinking those, interrogating them a bit, tearing them down when appropriate, but then rebuilding something in its place. And so that's kind of what I want to do here. So what I want to do is I want to name, these are very general kind of umbrellas or categories, but I'm going to name 3 ways that, in my experience, popular American largely white evangelicalism, at least that's the context I can comment on, 3 ways in my experience that kind of religious subculture, I would say, significantly misunderstands the very Old Testament that makes up 2/3 of its holy text, of its sacred scripture. And this is not me trying to do a hit piece. I'm not trying to be like unhelpfully critical, but I really have become passionate about more rightly understanding the Old Testament scriptures. And I'll comment a little bit more on the why at the end of this video, but I think that approaching a more helpful understanding of what's going on there is incredibly fruitful for then understanding what the New Testament is doing. And so yeah, I'm going to name these in a particular order, in order of, I think, broadest to most specific. And then after I name each one, I'm going to just comment on some scriptures that I think are helpful to reapproach with this understanding. So the first thing I want to name, and the first way in my experience evangelicals misunderstand Torah, is the big one. This is probably the most foundational thing that has shifted for me, which is simply that Torah, the law, is not, emphasis on not, about, quote, earning salvation. It is not about earning your standing in front of God. It's not about earning grace. It's not about anything along those lines. In other words, it's not legalism. The Torah does not equal legalism. That's very much how I was taught to understand what Torah is. And so, if you grew up in a religious setting like I did, I'm sure you heard many of the same things, but very frequently, Torah or law is held up as a counterpoint or a foil to grace. And so the idea commonly goes that the law is a system of doing the right things so that you earn God's salvation, and then how that is supposed to function in this way of thinking is that it's only there to show you that you can't actually earn it, and so therefore what you need is to throw yourself upon grace. And so the idea is that the whole construct is devoted to just show that we can't do it. But that rests on this fundamental idea under the surface that it rests on this idea of legalism. It rests on this idea of earning salvation, of works righteousness is another phrase that's commonly used. And so this is such a basic premise for so much kind of conversionistic, evangelistic method in America that it functions largely unexamined as a given, at least in the setting I grew up in. And so it was revelatory to me to start to learn that this is actually a deeply contested premise. The idea that the law is even about that in the first place. Very famously, this was questioned, at least in my reading life and kind of how I was exposed to it first in the so-called New Perspective on Paul. But if you are anti-New Perspective on Paul, this is not limited to that vein of scholarship by any means. That was just kind of the gateway into even realizing this, at least for me. People like E.P. Sanders very famously. But this whole question of Torah being legalistic is, I would argue, simply a bad understanding of the Old Testament, and it gets our entire kind of biblical understanding off on the wrong foot if we even start there. And so one of the first things to point to is, it's very simple. If you read Psalm 1 and you get to verse 2, and in the first psalm put at the beginning of the psalm book, the Psalter, it's significant that this psalm is placed first there. You know, see the little book Reading Psalms as Scripture is for a fantastic description of that. But the first psalm placed at the beginning of Israel's song book, of Israel's prayer book and worship book, the Psalter, talks about in verse 2 about how good it is to take delight in the law and to meditate on it. And if you read that with this understanding that the law is simply a legalistic transactional burden that actually is, burdensome to the individual, it doesn't make sense to think of it as a delight to meditate on it. Why would it be a delight to meditate on if its only function is to show our ineptitude as humans? If its only function is purely negative, to show that we can't earn our salvation, I guess someone could argue that, well, ultimately it's good if it helps you realize that you need grace. But how does that function in the ancient Israelites' view, who they don't have Jesus as Messiah in that time and place? So how is it delighting in the law to meditate on it if it only shows you your limitations, and if you are an ancient Israelite who doesn't have Jesus as Messiah to quote unquote show you grace yet? Right? These are kind of the weird the weird circles you get into when you start to see the cracks of this, like that this premise doesn't really stand when you take the Old Testament really on its own merits. And one of the greatest little books I like on this particular topic is John Goldingay's Do We Need the New Testament?, in which he goes to great pains to talk about the entirety, the prominence of grace in the Old Testament. And so what I want to replace this premise with, if the law is not about legalism, how I want to interrogate that and replace it is, I want to say that the law itself is God's gift to Israel, and it is God's instructions to Israel. It's not a law that is cold and rigid and you either keep or break in a binary sense. It is an instruction that you cultivate and keep. And again, see Drew Johnson's new book, Understanding Biblical Law, for a fantastic discussion of just that point. But if you think about God's law as instruction for life for this people, and you also realize that they viewed it as God's gracious gift to them, like that God deigned to pull them out of Egypt, rescue them. God heard their cries, rescued them out, and then gave them this instruction as part of the rescuing act, which, by the way, a lot of the book of Exodus is devoted to the giving of the law and the receiving it and the understanding it. It's not just the story. Really, the first kind of half of Exodus is just the story of escape, which is the part we love to focus on. But a lot of the book of Exodus, and not to mention, of course, Leviticus right afterwards, is all about the instruction itself. It is reading the Pentateuch is to itself devote a lot of time to meditating and delighting in the law that was given, just like the psalmist talks about. And so I think what needs to happen here is we need to kind of back up out of this mindset of it playing a purely negative role, meaning, about earning, and then to show you that you can't earn it, so you've got to find grace. It's not merely about that. That is getting off on the wrong foot to even understand the function of it. But it is a more wholesome, holistic set of instructions for life that you were you are meant to tend to and to cultivate, like Drew Johnson talks about in his book, as a garden, as you would a garden, and to keep it, right? To meditate on it, to reflect on it, to think about what it means to live within this instruction, because this was instruction given by God to the people so that they could enjoy the godly life, right? Be holy, famously in Leviticus, be holy as I am holy. And that is bound up in this whole set of instruction that's given, which presumes that then within this instruction is going to help the people understand what that means. What does that look like and not look like? And this is a good thing. This is a really good thing in the eyes of the ancient Israelite people. It's a good thing because it was from God who saved them and gave them instructions, right? Gave them a way to live. And this is in itself, this is a big thing E.P. Sanders was very famous for, like kind of bringing to, at least to kind of Western scholarship in recent decades, is to remember that this is in itself a gracious act of a gracious and loving God who cut a covenant, initiated a covenant with the people out of grace, and then part of that was giving them this instruction. So I think this is so foundational and so important to recover and put kind of like, it's like the floorboards. You got to replace maybe the slightly rotting floorboards and put in these more solid ones. And I think this is at that level of rethinking this. And it then helps you reapproach texts like Galatians 3:24, where Paul talks about the law being an instructor. That's not a negative term. It talks, some translations will say guardian or babysitter, which can be a little condescending, but it's not a negative term. It's just simply like a tutor. It's like, in the Greco-Roman world, a lot of young kids would have a tutor that would accompany them and teach them their way of life, teach them what they needed to know until they were able to be adults and not need the tutor anymore. But they weren't condescending towards their tutor, and they didn't look as their tutor and say, you only played this negative role in my life. All you did was you only showed me what I was incapable of doing. It's just such a backwards way to think about it, not a healthy way to think about it. And the tutor played a positive, instructive role towards bringing a child to maturity. And Paul says that is what the law did in the story of God for God's people. And so I think we should need to reapproach this whole thing and think about it in a more positive light, not only because it also starts to reconfigure how we think about Judaism itself, which is a whole other kind of layer of all this, but I think it also starts to help us reapproach how we think about the cohesiveness and coherence of the entirety of the scriptures. So that's my first one. The law is not fundamentally about earning your salvation. The law is actually a gracious gift of God as a way of life to God's people. Hi everyone, I'm excited to announce a partnership that I'm forging with Kairos Classroom. Some of you may have heard of Kairos Classroom already. If not, I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview of what it is. Now, I'm using that word partnership intentionally because I really am viewing this as a partnership. This is not just me shilling something. But what Kairos Classroom is an online program for learning biblical languages, Greek and Hebrew. And what I like about Kairos' Classroom's model is that they are kind of trying to push back on some of the fully asynchronous, kind of do it at your own pace models that are out there, and yet it is fully online. So they are combining, in my view, they're trying to combine the best of online education with the best of kind of more cohort model education. So if you take a class with them, you're in a small group that actually works through the material together, and they are set up in modules so that in 1 year, if you go through all their modules, you can achieve competence in biblical Greek or biblical Hebrew in 1 year if you stick through it and go through their modules in kind of the pace that they have set up. And it's also affordable. And so I'm excited about this partnership, and I am putting my money where my mouth is, so to speak, because I'm actually going to be taking modules from Kairos. So I have been looking for a way to gain competence in Hebrew specifically for some time, and so this partnership is actually going to give me the chance to do that. So I am actually taking Hebrew. As I record this is late in 2025. I'm taking their primer, and then I'm going to take Hebrew 1 starting in January of 2026. And so I'm going to be using Kairos Classroom. So I am not boosting something I'm not willing to participate in. And if you take a class in Hebrew, maybe we'll be in the class together. That could actually be kind of fun. But what I want to announce is that I am excited to be partnering with them and to provide a discount code. So if you are a watcher of my channel and you decide that you want to take Greek or Hebrew through Kairos, use my name as a discount code. It's just Joel Wentz. When you sign up, you'll get a discount, and that will let them know that you found Kairos through my channel. And I think it could be cool if those of you who watch my stuff if you want to gain some competence in the biblical languages, and we kind of incorporate that into the community that we're building here in our little corner of the internet. I would love that. And more than anything, I'd be excited if just more people gain some exposure to the ability to learn the languages of the scriptures. So that is the new partnership that I'm forging with Kairos. Really excited about it. Again, if you take Hebrew, maybe we'll be in the class together. Okay, so the second one, which kind of builds upon that, this gets a little bit more specific though. But so if the law is a good instruction to God's people for a good life, then what is it? What is the content of that law, and what are some things that we need to start understanding about what it's actually teaching itself? What is that law teaching the people? And one huge aspect of this that I have had to relearn is the second plank of my argument here, which is that becoming impure was not bad. I feel like I should insert a record scratch there. Becoming impure was not bad, or breaking the law, transgressing the law, to use True Johnson's more helpful parlance there. Becoming impure is not in and of itself transgressing the law. This is another thing that if you grew up in my context, again, you were probably taught over and over again about impurity related to leprosy or to the bleeding woman who shows up in the Gospels, or the idea of like Jesus eating with the sinners and the outcasts, and how he was transgressing the law. By implication, the idea was that he was transgressing the law by doing that. So there's all these things that we build upon with bad understandings of the law. But what's really important to understand is that the law itself contains within it stipulations for what happens when someone becomes impure, and the language of impurity is a separate category from morality. And this is something that people like David De Silva, or yes, Andrew Rilera, as controversial as that book is, he still does a really good job with this. Paul Sloan in his new book does a great job with this. Matthew Thiessen does a fantastic. Amy Jill Levine. These are all scholars that do amazing work on this very topic. But to become impure was a fact of life for the ancient Israelites. It was a fact of life. So some examples. Leviticus 13 talks about skin conditions that could cause someone to be impure. That was not a moralized issue. If you had a skin ailment, you would go to the priest. Again, read Leviticus 13 for the description of this. You would go to the priest, and the priest would determine whether or not this wasn't actually an impure skin disease. It likely would have been something kind of like an eczema, or maybe a fungal, infection. Kind of all this stuff is kind of gross, but this was kind of the real stuff that would happen, and so people would have to go to the priest to determine if it was impure or not. But it was not moral. It did not necessarily mean that person had done something to morally infringe upon the covenant. Of course, people could theorize, oh well, this person is impure. Perhaps God is striking them with that impurity because of an action. But it was not a one-for-one given that these things were linked. But another example that's even clearer, Leviticus 15, 2 chapters later, talks about bodily discharges. And this could be things like related to sexual activity. It could be related to bleeding, to a woman's biological cycle. These were things that were the warp and woof of life that were not moralized. It was not an immoral act to have one of these irregular discharges. Talking about a lot of kind of gross bodily functions here, but it just was not an immoral act, and yet it made a person impure, and then they had to go through these stipulations to become pure again. One more quick example is Numbers 19 talks about the impurity of touching a corpse. It was not an immoral action to touch a corpse. What would you do if you were the oldest son and you needed to bury a dead father or a dead family member? You had to become impure to tend correctly to your honorably to your dead family member. Honoring your parents is an important commandment. There were instructions in the law for burying the dead correctly, with honor again. But you had to become impure to do that. But that wasn't an immoral action. It was just something that had to happen. So one of the things that I've recovered in my study is this realization that impurity was something that was inevitable. It was not immoral, and it was not bad, and it was not transgressing the law. What was transgressing the law was to become impure and then not follow the legal stipulations for becoming pure again. That was when you started to tread into transgressing the law, to not keeping the law correctly. The Israelites were meant to follow the law if and when they became impure, so that they could then become pure again and then enjoy the pure communal fellowship with God at the center of their life, right? So this is a very, very, very different framework for understanding the dimensions between morality and purity and impurity. They overlap in some cases, but not in all. And so it starts to shed light on, in Leviticus 5:2, for example, there are stipulations on unknowingly coming into contact with the dead. There's actually sacrifices and offerings that could be offered to purify for exactly that situation, unintentional contact with the corpse, which then made you impure, but you didn't. This is the interesting thing. Purity and impurity were beyond just intentions or even awareness, right? There was to get into kind of the ontology of it, I don't know if you can describe it, but in that worldview, there was purity and impurity were very real forces in the world that could impact you whether or not you even knew it, right? And so people were instructed to take this stuff very seriously, because you could unknowingly come into contact with a corpse apparently, and then there were stipulations for how you purify yourself in the unknowing action of becoming impure. So purity and impurity would affect you outside of your own cognizance or willpower, which is something that's very hard for us to understand, I think, in our cultural context, in which everything is kind of interiorized, psychologized. It's all about our own will and identity and whether or not we make it happen or don't, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's just a really different way of conceptualizing the world around us. But purity and impurity were forces that Israel was instructed to take very seriously, and this was rooted in that foundational Levitical command to be holy as I am holy. To be holy, meaning the people communally needed to be holy. And so to follow these instructions to stay pure was a way of maintaining this contact with a pure and holy God who would not and could not tolerate impurities, right? And that is a really important thing to understand, and it's important to differentiate it in a nuanced way from the morality and immorality kind of framework that we typically collapse it into. So the way I grew up was that impurity was very frequently more simplistically understood than this idea of it actually, you could become impure and still be following faithfully the law. I think some of the reasons this matters, first of all, I think it matters to more correctly just understand the context of the instructions that people were being given. But also, it starts to really reframe what we see Jesus doing in the Gospels. So when he starts calling the Pharisees whitewashed tombs, for example, he's calling them impure because he's saying that they have death inside them. And this was not just an insult, although I imagine it was very insulting, but it was also very troubling to people who believed they were faithfully keeping the law, and yet he was essentially calling them walking sources of impurity that by implication would spread their impurity around, even though they were the ones who were ostensibly trying to teach people about how to faithfully follow the law, which included being pure. And they would get into debates about hand washing, for example. That's in Matthew 23 when he uses that language, by the way. And so when you start to bracket out these understandings, you get to a little bit more of a nuanced and precise understanding of what was happening. You also get more, at least for me, I get more, sympathy, understanding, compassion for the average Israelite in the ancient world that was simply trying to follow these instructions faithfully because they believed a good and holy God gave them to them, and that purity and impurity mattered. And it wasn't this, I don't see it as this, again, this onerous, heavy, taxing burden upon them, but it was actually more just something about, here is how, they wouldn't necessarily use these terms, but here's how flourishing life looks. It looks like pursuing purity if and when inevitably impurity impinges upon you. And again, it's all rooted in theological principles, namely a holy God is at the center of all of this who gave us these instructions. Okay, so that's the second pillar, is that impurity is not bad. Impurity is normal, and actually the law understood that and had stipulations within it for what it meant to live with the inevitable contact with impurity in their life. Okay, third and final one, at least for this video, but this is like a gold mine of a topic, so I might come back to it more. But the third and final one for my purposes today is about sacrifice. And I haven't talked about sacrifice yet, which is, if you read Leviticus, is a massive, massive, massive aspect of that book. But I'm going to put this a little bit provocatively. Sacrifice is not merely about paying for sins. Sacrifice in Torah is not merely about paying for sins. This is another thing that I was taught very, I would say simplistically, in a flat kind of way, is that the law, again, let's tie all these things together. The law is an onerous burden. It is about earning your salvation. It has these harsh stipulations about purity and impurity that were exclusive and oppressive to people. And it was all about, giving sacrifices to pay for your sins. Now, take my purity, impurity commentary just from a minute ago. If you start to bracket out the morality dimension from it, what do you do then with the language of sin and sacrifice? If everything is about sin and everything is about sacrifice for paying for sins, there is no place then for these stipulations that have to do with impurity that's not a moralized issue. So impurity that's not a sin, how do you, and then you have these sacrifices or steps to be cleansed from that. What in the world do you do with that in a system that limits all of it to sacrifice being about paying for sin? It's just too small a view, is a lot of what I'm coming back to and over again in this video. It's too small a view. But part of what is going on in the Levitical code is a range of sacrificial types. So there are indeed sin offerings, absolutely. There are also grain offerings. There are also peace offerings, right, that don't have anything to do with sin one for one. There were sins that, and also to further complicate the picture, there are sins that actually cannot be atoned for with sacrifice. Again, Andrew Lara and Paul Sloan do really fantastic work breaking this down in their books. But the categories of sins that cannot be atoned for are things like murder, like idolatry, like high-handed. See Numbers 15 for like the high-handed language of sins, especially when it comes to idolatry and blasphemy. And certain ways of practices of sexual immorality also can't be atoned for. And so there are sins and unintentional sins that can be atoned for with the sacrificial kind of mediation, mediated by the priests. But there are also all kinds of sacrifices that people would bring simply for peace, for fellowship. There are free will offerings that people would bring into the system to demonstrate their adoration of God. There were sacrifices that one of the refrains in Leviticus is a pleasing aroma to God. So some of the idea there is about just communing with God, like being able to spend time in God, share a meal with God is some of the language that's being used, the imagery that's being used. There's also sacrifices that have to do with ratifying a vow someone would make, nothing to do with sin. So there is a complicated range of sacrifices that have to do with a lot of aspects of life that are not merely about paying for sin. And this is something that, again, was revelatory to me because of the simplistic way I was taught about Torah, which had, again, collapsed a lot of these understandings into more kind of a rigid, systematized understanding to drive, I would argue, it was to drive kind of conversionistic decisions, because it was all about, again, coming up with the limitations. We're inevitably sinful. We can't earn our own salvation. We need someone else to fix it for us. That person is Jesus. So the law purely plays this constraining, pressurized negative role to get us to Jesus. But that does not account for peace and free will and vow offerings in the Levitical Code, which take up pages of the Levitical Code. So what do we have to do? What do we do with that in this simplistic, maybe Romans Road, evangelistic, conversionistic kind of understanding that flattens out all of this stuff? It doesn't really have room for it. And that's one of the reasons I've become so passionate about it, is because I'm reapproaching all this stuff and having, there is an important function that all of these things play in the grandeur and the drama and the story of what God is doing with humans, with people in the world. Okay, that was a little bit of a tangent on this, but what I want to say then about this whole sacrificial piece, so in addition to the idea that there are ranges of sacrifices that don't have to do with sins, and there are sins that actually can't be sacrificed for, the question becomes, what was sacrifice positively meant for? And it was meant, I would categorize it more and label it more as a ongoing relationship maintenance system. So it was a way to maintain relationship and contact with God, being in the temple, God dwelling in the temple. The sacrificial system was a way of maintaining God's presence in the land, right? And in the story, particularly when it culminates in exile, there's dramatic vision of God's presence departing the temple, right? And it's because sins pile up, and sins actually affect not just the people but the land, and things become so infected with sin, and they pile up that God's presence departs, right? That's the dramatic kind of result of all of this, is that presence is lost, which you kind of retroactively understand what's going on there, and it's because the system was not being followed faithfully and appropriately and with due reverence and respect and honor. And that's what happens, and then the people are exiled out of the land, right? They do return, but importantly in the scriptural narrative, God's presence is not dramatically depicted as returning into the temple. if you then have the New Testament as another aspect of the narrative, you see God's presence return, but not in the temple, but you see it return in the incarnation, right, of Christ. And so that becomes the arc of God's presence returning to the land, to the people. Sorry, I'm going off on my tangent here about kind of the meta-narrative of Scripture, but I think that this stuff, when you start to reincorporate all these nuances and these understandings of what the law and what the sacrificial system was and was not doing, you start to see how the entire narrative hangs together, I think in a way more robust and compelling way. But let me get back to the sacrificial thing, because this does relate to the life of Jesus. But if the sacrifices had all these functions, and there were certain actions that could not be atoned for in sacrifices, and lack of attention to all of this is what resulted in exile, this contextualizes a lot of the prophetic laments against sacrifice and the sacrificial system in the temple. So two examples of this are Amos 5 and Hosea 6, the very famous texts where Amos talks about let justice roll instead. I hate your show, I hate your offerings. Hosea 6 is that famous I desire mercy and not sacrifice, which, again, in the context of my upbringing, a lot of times these texts were used to pit law and grace as simplistic foils against each other. And you would reach back into Hosea and say, see, it's there all along. God doesn't even really want these sacrifices. He just wants mercy. The problem with that understanding is that negates the context of these prophetic laments. Particularly Hosea is extremely clear about this. And what Hosea is lamenting, this is really, really, really important to understand, and sheds a lot of light on what sacrifices were even meant to be the whole time. What Hosea is lamenting there is the departure of Israel from the covenant, from the relationship with God writ large. And yet they still keep bringing the sacrifices. So the covenant is effectively broken, effectively abandoned. There's no respect being given to it because of the sinful actions that have piled up upon the people because of their lack of faithfulness to God. And yet the sacrifices are still happening. And that is the context for these prophetic laments. Amos is similar. So what the prophets are lamenting is the fact that the people keep bringing sacrifices without paying attention to the fact that the covenant has actually been abandoned, that their covenant and relationship has been broken, and yet they keep bringing these sacrifices thinking that they're maintaining it, but it has been long abandoned. It is beyond repair. That is the context of when Hosea says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Or Amos says, I hate your show, let justice flow down instead. And that also contextualizes, fast forward to Jesus, when Jesus talks to the Pharisees in Matthew 23 and says, you are tithing your spices, but you're neglecting the weightier matters of the law. This is when Jesus, as a prophetic type figure, starts to make a lot of sense in the context of these ancient prophets that were lamenting the abandonment of the bigger purposes of what God was doing in the covenant, and yet the people continually defiantly bringing these sacrifices, thinking that they were maintaining something, maybe thinking they were manipulating God into staying, or who knows what. But the prophets just will have none of it because they're missing the forest for the trees, so to speak. This really starts, for me, in my journey, this really started to reformulate my whole understanding of what's going on, why God gave the law, what function the law is supposed to play, and then how it sets up the ministry of Jesus, which are some things that I've already alluded to in the context of talking through these things in my video. And I will just say, this might be a video in and of itself, but when you start to re-understand what the sacrifices are and are not doing, and then you start to think about when the New Testament uses language of sacrifice for Christ, it really starts to mess up the categories that I grew up with, which is, again, why I'm so passionate about understanding atonement carefully and what we're talking about there. And when the book of Hebrews, written largely to Jewish followers of Christ in the early century there, the book of Hebrews uses language of blood and sacrifice and is really trying to wrestle with and help the reader wrestle with what does this mean to think about the category of sacrifices applied to Christ. There's a whole vein of thinking to go into about all that, which I'm not going to go into for sake of time in this video because this video has already gotten over half an hour. Oof. Okay, let me wrap this up. Let me land the plane with some few thoughts on why this matters. I've already hinted at these things as I've talked through all this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But there are three things I want to point out about why this all matters beyond what I've already said. First of all, I think that reapproaching a better understanding of Torah, really at bottom, if nothing else, it helps us have a better understanding of Judaism. There's a really sordid, terrible history of anti-Judaic thought, anti-Semitic maybe thought in Christian theology, Christian history, the Christian actions, the Christian church. It's horrendous stuff if you really look into it. It's terrible. And I think there's an argument that correcting our view of Torah can help us have, frankly, a better view of Judaism and the Jewish people and the history of the Jewish life and what Christians owe to that history. Like, we are part of that story. And correcting these understandings can just help us have. Very frequently Christians can, I think unintentionally, and I think this is more the fault of leaders and preachers and teachers than it is about just the average person trying to be faithful. I don't want to come across as being condescending towards that person, but I do think a lot of people raised in similar settings I was raised in have fairly demeaning understanding of Judaism as just this like misguided religion of just all about works righteousness and just trying to earn, and they had no sense of grace, and like all that stuff can kind of seep into your conceptions of an entire people, and I think it's really important to be careful about that, and this is one way we can reapproach a better understanding, I think. Secondly, as a Christian, I think that reapproaching this dramatically reduces the tension between the Testaments, between the so-called Old and New Testaments. I like how John Goldingay puts it as First and Second Testament. Michael Heiser also was known for calling the New Testament the appendix, which I thought was it was kind of a playful term, but he talked about it in the sense that like so much is already in the Old Testament. The New Testament is kind of almost an appendix, a reflection upon what's already there, and I really like that. But I am very passionate about reducing the tension between these two testaments, because as I talked about law and grace being these foils against each other, very, very, very frequently the Old Testament and the New Testament are similarly pitched against each other as this like highly pressurized conflict or tension, and it's just not there. I just don't think it's there fundamentally. I think that there's a ton of continuity. There is a lot of grace in the Old Testament. It's soaked and saturated with grace, and there's a lot of continuity of understanding what Jesus is doing with the law carried through into the New Testament. So reducing the tension between these can just, I think, help faithful people approach a like truly holistically, canonically biblical sense of what God has been up to in history. So correcting our bad view of Judaism, reducing the tension between the testaments, and then third and final, this really flows right out of my second point there, is that it just really helps us better understand what Jesus is doing in the gospel accounts. And it helps us better understand what Paul and Peter are writing about, in their epistles. Again, I'll point back to Jesus and the Law of Moses as a recent fantastic example of this, Paul Sloan's work. But understanding Jesus' debates with the Pharisees and the scholars at the time, understanding the tension he would get into with what's going on with Sabbath and hand washing and dietary laws, and his take on eating impure foods, for example, all of that stuff flows right out of a better understanding of what God was up to with the law. And then similarly, when you start reading about Paul wrestling with, as the primary like Gentile-facing kind of missionary in the ancient world, or at least in the early century, to when the New Testament was compiled and circulated, Paul is wrestling with what does it mean for Gentiles to be grafted into this whole thing. Jason Staples is another one who does amazing work on this, like understanding the incorporation of Gentiles into this ongoing story of what God is doing. A holy God who gives holy instruction to people who follow it, who then are exiled, and the presence of God leaves, and then the presence of God returns in Jesus, and then there is a ministry of restoration that Jesus is enacting as the very presence of God in the world. And then the fact that Gentiles are welcomed into that, see Acts 15 for kind of the nitty-gritty of how that even flows into it. It just makes the entire story cohesive, and it contextualizes Jesus in a way that does not pit Jesus against Moses or the law. And also it has a place for Paul as the kind of Gentile missionary in this whole understanding of things. I'm not going to say it papers over, I'm not going to say there's no tensions, I'm not going to say there's no difficult text to wrestle with, and nothing like that, but it does give a framework and an overarching understanding that injects a ton of life into the story, I think. And it all hinges on us understanding Torah better. So there you go. That's a lot of stuff that I just worked through. I hope that you found this helpful. If this gets your gears turning, if you have pushback or if you have questions or even want to give a hearty amen, I would love to hear all of that. If you have other resources that you would recommend along the lines of the things that I mentioned in my previous video and things that I rattled off in this one, I'd love to hear any and all of that. But I really hope this resonates with you. I hope this gives you some language or maybe even puts some finger on some things that maybe you have wrestled with too. But as always, thanks for taking a few minutes to watch.